How rogue did Yevgeny Prigozhin really go in his Wagner uprising? Has Russia seen the last of him?
It looks like Prigozhin's past skills and his people are still important for Putin, at least in several areas, for instance, in Africa.
My guest this week on Conflict Zone is Russian investigative journalist and security services expert Andrei Soldatov. His Agentura website tracks the Russian intelligence services. Will Putin purge the system?
Putin is really good at conducting repressions, especially against his own people. We have several FSB people in jail, we have ministers in jail, governors in jail.
How long can Putin hold on to power? Andrei Soldatov, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you for having me.
You are in contact with whistleblowers in the Russian security services. Why did Prigozhin really stop his march toward Moscow?
Well, because it was never about trying to take power and to take Moscow. It was about renegotiating his deal with Putin and the Ministry of Defense. And when he understood that he miscalculated, he wanted to still to get something out of this situation, so he sent his columns to Moscow, but it was mostly to play for a time. When finally he got what he wanted, or at least what he could get out of this situation, he stopped.
Nevertheless, he got quite far, and it's being called the most dramatic challenge to Putin's authority since he came to power 23 years ago. Is Prigozhin still a threat to Putin?
I think the biggest threat is not Prigozhin per se, but the reaction of the army and of the Russian security services. Everybody understood that Prigozhin, while he might be extremely adventurous, yes, he has a lot of people under his command, several thousand people, but the reaction of the army is what matters now. And given the fact that nobody wanted to stop Prigozhin and the security services, the people who were put in charge of providing with political stability for Putin's regime did absolutely nothing. And the FSB local office in Rostov-on-Don just barricaded themselves in their headquarters. That sent a very warning signal to Putin and to Moscow that it's not all okay, and these people who are in charge of, while protecting him, actually doing nothing.
Then, nevertheless, the Kremlin has been trying to dismiss the uprising, calling it minor trouble. In contrast, you have the EU's top diplomat warning that Putin has lost the monopoly of force and an unstable Russia becomes a risk. How serious do you see the uprising, and how fragile is the Russian state?
Again, I think the problem is not only with Prigozhin. He is an extremely interesting character, but his options are limited. He doesn't have any, public support provided by other members of the Russian elites, for instance, and the army didn't support him openly. But several things which happened during this uprising were extremely worrying. For instance, there's now infamous video where Prigozhin is sitting together with Deputy Minister of Defense Yevgeny and the first deputy head of the Russian military intelligence, Alexeyev, and they sharing laugh about the idea of taking, or getting actually, Shoigu and Gerasimov. That was absolutely shocking for me, and I immediately contacted my sources in the Russian security services and special forces and asked them what do they think about the idea that you have the first head of the Russian military intelligence basically saying, well, you can have them if you want. And my people said, well, actually, Alexeyev was right. And I think that was even more worrisome for Putin, because in this case, you have the most capable elements in the Russian military and Russian security services publicly questioning the military leadership.
Given all of that, what you've just highlighted there, how much support do you think Prigozhin might have had covertly from inside of the security services, the military, the elites? Because, I mean, it appeared that him and his Wagner mercenaries, that they met no resistance.
Yes, absolutely. Once again, I just wanted to stress that the FSB decided to do absolutely nothing, and they control several...
Why did they fail to stop Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner uprising earlier? Why?
Well, the biggest, I think the answer is that Prigozhin is a kind of maverick. He's not part of the system. So for the system, for the Russian system of intelligence, security, and military structures, it's really difficult to understand his place and position. Everybody understands that it's all about Putin-Prigozhin personal connection. And the problem is nobody knows, for instance, what is this connection as we speak. So maybe it's really bad, maybe it's getting better, maybe it's getting worse, we don't know. The generals also, they didn't know at the moment of the uprising what might be that connection. And they just decided to wait and see.
You've highlighted one particular point in your previous writing, the fact that the security service, in particular in Moscow, they called on Wagner fighters to go and arrest Yevgeny Prigozhin, their own leader. And this is especially extraordinary because the FSB's military counterintelligence operatives are within Wagner's ranks. How are you seeing this? Because this is their job, isn't it? Isn't it a huge break in loyalty to the Kremlin? How would this be being viewed right now by Putin himself?
It's a really good question, because on the surface, and for people like us, for outsiders of the system of the FSB, of course, it looks like a complete failure. These people were put there to warn the Kremlin about the problems which might come up out of the Wagner group. And that was their primary job, right? And the FSB is not only about repressions, it's about preventing these kind of things of happening. So they felt that is absolutely clear. But at the same time, the problem with Putin is that he is, to some extent, part of the system. Just remember that he is a trained KGB officer. And in the similar circumstances, 30 years ago, in 1991, when the KGB and some people at the Politburo wanted to stage a coup d'etat and topple Gorbachev, most of the ranks inside of the KGB decided to do exactly the same, to wait and see. Putin did absolutely nothing. His friends, people he now respects and who are now in the key positions and the Russian security services, they all did the same. They did absolutely nothing in 1991. So you have this strange emotional thing, sharing of feeling that actually when something really big is happening, it's not up to the security services to decide when to act, which is absolutely counterproductive, but nevertheless, they have it.
Senior Pentagon officials have highlighted that the uprising highlights poor coordination between the military and other security services. Can you give us a window into how deep the connections are, for example, between the military, Russia's security services, and Wagner in particular?
Well, first of all, I do not completely agree with his assessment. Just remember that at the very time of this uprising, the Russian army kept fighting the Ukrainian counteroffensive. There was no collapse of the Russian forces in the battlefield. So the only thing they failed to face and actually to deal with was this particular mutiny of Prigozhin. And here you have all the problems.
Belarus's Lukashenko said that he ultimately brokered the deal that saw Prigozhin and his Wagner forces abandon their march toward Moscow. Is Lukashenko humiliating Putin, or did he save him?
Well, I think the whole thing about Belarus and Lukashenko participation, of course, made Putin look extremely weak. Just remember that for many, many years, Putin was promoting the idea and making it sacrifice the idea of national sovereignty. That was such a big thing that you can, justify all kinds of repressions if you want to, to promote this thing. And that is why we got all the repressions in our country, because it is the wake of national sovereignty. And when we got the real problem, Putin got his real problem, he let his minor partner, Alexander Lukashenko, go fix his internal problem. So it doesn't look for Putin really good.
Lukashenko also saying that Prigozhin is now in Belarus, although there's been no independent confirmation. He also hasn't been heard from in more than a week. What do you think is happening to Prigozhin? Is he still alive?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I think he's still very much alive. First of all, in this crazy situation, it's really difficult to understand what is going on. But there are several interesting signs. First of all, the whole thing about criminal charges. So it's changing, but as far as I get, and as far as everybody get it, the criminal charges finally dropped. which is a big thing. Because when Putin and the Kremlin wants to expel somebody for real, well, you have the criminal charges against this person. For instance, in my case, I'm a wanted man in Russia and I have criminal charges against me. So if I ever get back to the country, I'm facing up to 10 years in prison. And that is a guarantee I would never get back. But for Prigozhin, they decided to make an exception. So there is no criminal charges. So legally speaking, there is nothing to prevent him from getting back to St. Petersburg, to Moscow, to, I don't know, to save at least part of his business empire.
Prigozhin, though, I mean, he's been promised this immunity, we have to say, but he got rich off of his close ties to Putin. Now Putin has actually mentioned that the finances of Prigozhin's lucrative catering firm will be investigated. How do you see that? Is this a signal that he could actually be prosecuted for financial crimes? Or, is Putin just trying to take him down a notch?
I think it's about some parts of Prigozhin's business empire, because of course there are some competitors and they've been there for years, but they had no chance. Now we got this chance. So they are trying to win these contracts provided by the government and the Ministry of Defense. But it looks like Prigozhin's skills and his people are still important for Putin, at least in several areas, for instance, in Africa. And it looks like the Kremlin doesn't want to completely disband Wagner and Wagner operations in the Middle East and Africa.
Prigozhin had been railing against the top military brass for months. Ultimately, he said that the Kremlin's stated reasoning behind the war in Ukraine was false. Why did Putin allow the threat posed by Prigozhin to fester for so long?
Well, Putin understands that very clearly, that even the most unpopular wars could produce very popular generals. And these generals, at some moment, might become a political threat. That happened many times in Russian history. Putin understands that. He understands that he cannot let it go. So he wanted to have some counterbalance to that, some sort of maverick who might expose the problems in the military and to keep military generals off balance. That's exactly what was the role of Prigozhin for all these months.
Let's talk about the Wagner mercenary group and what happens to them next. They've been thrown into disarray. The fight for control is said to have just begun. Lukashenko has invited mercenaries to relocate to an abandoned military base in the country. There are some reports of new satellite images appearing to show tents being set up in Belarus to that effect. Isn't that their best offer, to go to Belarus? And are they likely to take it?
Well, I think that at some moment Putin just decided to relocate Wagner to save his public image as someone who is still in control of the situation, and because it was so humiliating to have, Wagner soldiers marching the roads in Russia, so he decided to relocate him to Belarus. But of course, I mean, Wagner has no other customers but the Russian state. Belarus is very much penetrated by the Russians. So it's not like he was expelled to some independent country and out of reach of Moscow. That's not true.
The U.S. says that right now they're continuing to see some elements of the Wagner Group in Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine. Ukrainian intelligence says that Wagner will not fight in Ukraine anymore. Do you think that Wagner in Ukraine will go willingly?
It's a very interesting question. We have some reports recently, actually today, that some Wagner officers, they issued a statement that they stopped recruiting people right now for fighting in Ukraine. But the language we use is very ambiguous. It's like, we are stopping for now. So maybe they are waiting for some, for some reform. Maybe they would be given a new name. So, but I think some elements of this group will be fighting as they did before.
Let's talk a little bit more about how Russians are viewing all of this. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that Moscow has been suffering full-scale weakness, he calls it. Prigozhin has apparently tapped into the view that Putinism is a corrupt system where the ruling elite have been enriching themselves and are more interested in pleasing Putin than doing what is right for national interests or ordinary people. That's a message which seems to have resonated. How high is the dissatisfaction with Putin and Putinism?
Well, in the military, there is a clear feeling that the Russian generals, as always, are not extremely competent. And it's a very interesting and ironical situation, because it is right now that the Russian army is getting this newfound confidence in themselves, because actually the Ukrainian offensive is extremely slow. That is the perception of the Russian army. It's not my perception, but it's how they see the situation. They feared that it could be really big. Now they see it's not that big and not that horrible. So they are getting this sense of that they are not actually that bad. At the same time, they keep blaming the generals, and that is why they supported, to some extent, silently maybe, Prigozhin's criticism, because they shared the same feeling. But it does mean that they are ready to do something about it. They're still very pro-war, and the feeling that we need to fight with the war for a very long time is there.
But here is how the head of the CIA is framing the situation. He says that disaffection with the war will continue to gnaw away at the Russian leadership, and that it creates a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the CIA to recruit spies in Russia. You are very familiar with the security services. Do you think that the CIA will find fertile ground for recruitment?
Well, I think that we are dealing with a lot of wishful thinking here. We are trying to identify every sign of dissent as a signal that the system will inevitably collapse in, I don't know, in the matter of several months. I would be more cautious, to be honest. It's not like that. Lots of people accepted the idea of the war, including the Russian elites. Putin is really good at conducting repressions, especially against his own people. We have several FSB people in jail, we have ministers in jail, governors in jail. So it is a big thing for the Russian society. And lots of people in the elite understand that actually there is no way for them but to stay loyal to Putin. So I would say that for CIA, it might be an opportunity, but I would be cautious. Also, the problem is that the CIA recruited their best people when there was a chance for defections. And right now, for the Russian elites, because of all the restrictions for travel, I mean, it's not really easy to make it to Europe or to the United States. The chances that the same people as the Russian elites would think, okay, maybe now I start spying for the Americans, and that would give me a chance to move and to live in the United States, they're quite slim.
Putin, since the uprising, he has been seeming to be bent on projecting normalcy and stability. We've seen him ramping up public appearances. In the week after the uprising, he gave a number of national addresses portraying the rebellion as a heroic episode. He traveled to the southern region of Dagestan, where he sipped local cognac. He spoke about growing regional tourism. He even attended a technology fair in Moscow. What do Russians make of that? Are they buying it?
Well, not all of them, of course, especially in big cities. But in provinces, you have lots of people who are still very supportive of Putin, and they accept the Russian propaganda version of the events, that Putin made every effort to avoid bloodshed. Well, to some extent, he did, actually. There was no real big bloodshed, except for these unfortunate pilots. And it is a problem for the military, not for the population.
Prigozhin, I mean, his rants, they really offer this alternative to the war propaganda for many Russians. An unvarnished glimpse from the front lines. He highlighted the useless and unjustified losses. Can Russians really go back to regularly scheduled programming?
Well, that's a good question. But I think what Prigozhin wanted to do, he wanted to become some sort of new repressive force in the Russian society, with the license to attack the Russian elites, to mobilize the Russian society. Putin doesn't want that. He still thinks that it's possible to win this war without a total mobilization. But we don't know what might happen if, say, the Ukrainian offensive goes really successful. We just don't know. That might change the situation. And, well, if that changes, there might be new space and new room for Prigozhin and people like him.
Let's talk about Putin's efforts to shore up his power. First of all, is a crackdown underway?
There is one thing which is clear. All security services and the army and the National Guard, they learned the lesson that when you have a problem in the inner circle of Putin, it's better not to interfere. And I think it is a very bad signal for Putin because, well, what if tomorrow some other guy, say Kadyrov, or someone on the Russian Security Council, well, come up on the Russian television and say, well, Vladimir Vladimirovich got ill and we need to replace him with someone. There would be a huge confusion. That is clear right now.
If you look at the overall situation, though, Russia's most senior generals, they've dropped out of view since the uprising. I'm thinking about General Gerasimov. He's reportedly not appeared in public. He's, of course, in charge of the war effort in Ukraine. The Kremlin has also been deflecting questions about the whereabouts of General Surovikin, who is seen as aligned with Prigozhin and believed to be detained. What do you think is happening to them?
Well, it's really difficult to understand. I've been checking the information about Surovikin for all these days. It looks like the reports that he was sent to prison, we cannot confirm them, but it seems that he was at least interrogated. And it's quite interesting that we are hearing these rumors about the military generals, but not about the security services, which is a very interesting thing. Well, you have these people, I mean, the FSB, the National Guard, all other security services, put in charge of Putin's personal security and political stability. Yet all the questions the Kremlin has, it's all about the military.
How much impact do you think these events of the past weeks are going to have on the war in Ukraine?
It's a good question because on the one hand, we see that Wagner didn't participate directly, at least in big numbers, in trying to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It is a job for the regular Russian army. Well, at the same time, Wagner is still a very capable force, and they have its reputation in the Russian military. Yet there is new confusion now because of the mutiny staged by Wagner, because of these pilots who were killed for absolutely nothing. Well, Putin's version of events was that these pilots were killed because they are Russian heroes. But what the military are hearing is that there would be no justice for these pilots and their families. Nobody would be prosecuted for killing these pilots. And that creates a new confusion. It means that you have the regular army still fighting on the battlefield. You have a number of private military companies, and the army now is looking at these private military companies with some suspicion because these guys already proved that they can kill Russian soldiers and they can get away with it. So this kind of confusion in long term might affect the situation on the battlefield.
The Ukrainian counteroffensive has not yet achieved significant success, according to NATO's top commander in Europe. Do you think that now there is more pressure on Putin to end the war?
No, I don't think so. I think what Putin understands is there was such a big investment in the idea of Ukrainian counteroffensive. Well, it was a big thing for the Ukrainian government, for the Ukrainian leadership. It was a big thing for NATO, for the West. In Russia, it was played as a sign that the Russian army, well, behaved and actually was not extremely great in the beginning of the war, but we are getting better. And there is a strange feeling now, especially because it's all about history and the Second World War and all of that. So there is this idea shared by many that Russian army always starts the war in a very bad shape, but they're getting better on the way, and Putin is trying to capitalize on this feeling.
I'd like to ask you one last question about the uprising, the Wagner uprising, because many are concerned that if Putin does fall, the concern is that a replacement leader could be worse. Kremlin critic Khodorkovsky said the following: "We glimpsed how the regime's inevitable fall is likely to come about and the forces that will seek to take over, so-called national patriots led by another thug." If you look at the big picture, do you think that Russia is ultimately doomed to have one thug replaced by another after Putin?
Well, unfortunately, it might happen because the more this war goes, the more the Russian society is getting used to this war. And now we are getting this emotional argument in favor of the war because there are so many casualties, there are so many people killed. And even the people who felt confused about the beginning of the war, now they have this feeling, well, in my village, someone get killed by these Ukrainians, so why should I feel sorry about the war? So in some way, the support for the war is getting, well, if not bigger, but it's more stable. And it means that the whole of the society is projecting itself to the idea that, well, it's going to be a really long war. And in a long war, you get people like generals and who are, well, using very tough language, more and more popular. And at some moment, they might get some position in the power. Yeah, that's true.
How long do you think Putin has?
Well, I think we are talking about years.
Andrei Soldatov, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on Conflict Zone.
Thank you.